Greetings, fellow traveller. Do come in, won't you? I can only imagine the serendipitous series of events that have led to you finding me here, in this isolated and crooked old cabin. But now that we are here, let us talk, you and I, and tell tales of giants, of warriors, of great behemoths made of iron and steam, and of beasts that stalk the forests on two legs. Yes, my friend, rumours persist of hunters in the forests, great dark creatures of fur and fang that emerge at nightfall and seek to wet their muzzles with the blood of the careless and the foolhardy. But worry not, for in my hands I hold a very special book by a man called Jakub Rozalski, which talks about such creatures and is bound to contain some of the answers we seek. So let us stoke the fire, secure the windows, and pray we see dawn together, friends, as we go on a journey through the worlds of Jakub Rozalski and his mysterious tome, Howling at the Moon. Jakub Rozalski is a Polish artist that likes to combine traditional oil painting styles with sci-fi and fantasy subject matter, and has reached quite some renown for their work on the board game Scythe and the strategy video game Iron Harvest. Like his Swedish peer, Simon Stalenhag, Rozalski likes to juxtapose the traditional and mundane with the unexpected, such as when we see early 20th century agricultural workers dwarfed by huge mechanical war machines. Philosopher, author and all-round smart guy Mark Fisher wrote about this sort of phenomena in his book The Weird and the Eerie, largely based around his definition of the weird, as shown by the two quotes I have pulled here. The weird brings to the familiar something which ordinarily lies beyond it. The form that is perhaps most appropriate to the weird is montage, the conjoining of two or more things which do not belong together. And the sense of wrongness associated with the weird, the conviction that this does not belong, is often a sign that we are in the presence of the new. The weird here is a signal that the concepts and frameworks which we have previously employed are now obsolete. Jakub Rozalski's 2018 book, Howling at the Moon, is a collection of his greatest artworks to that point, grouped into several different settings, namely the Ancients, World of 1920 Plus, Apocalypse Day, Wolfpack 1863, and Folk Stories. Each setting has a somewhat different feel to it, with some focusing on a more alternate history approach to world building, and others a more whimsical or fantastical vision of the world, though each is given the same oil painting style treatment, making it at once nostalgic and yet unmistakably Rozalski. Let's take a look at a few pieces so you can see what I mean. This is the first image of the book, and as the song goes, the beginning is a very good place to start. Stranger in a Strange Land comes from the Ancients section of the book, a selection of images that focus on giant golems and titans, often alongside barbarian hordes, rogue samurai and Vikings. So let's talk about why this image is so typical of a Rozalski piece. A good number of Rozalski's artworks position someone that is seemingly a protagonist in the foreground of the picture, usually from a fairly low perspective looking up at some wider scene, or in this case, a gargantuan menace. Towards the bottom of the picture, low down and close to our perspective, we have what appears to be a samurai or Japanese warrior wielding a katana and facing off against a number of spear-wielding locals, whilst beyond them, a gigantic kaiju-like figure dominates the upper sections of the image, creating a genuinely unsettling sense of scale. Their size appears almost impossible to fathom, as we can see they are quite some distance away, but they appear to be marching towards our samurai friend and dragging a huge mace or hammer that looks capable of putting quite the dent in our protagonist's intentions. This choice of a shared perspective makes us naturally associate ourselves with the foreground character, since we are effectively seeing what they are seeing, and the low perspective creates a sense of unease and foreboding in the viewer, making us feel small and vulnerable in the face of this overwhelming foe. The positioning of the barbarians, pillars and birds between the foreground and background help us understand the scale of what we are seeing and the true horror of what faces this brave but probably doomed hero. Rozalski loves depicting courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and this is a feature in much of his work. Rozalski is something of a Polish patriot, and a theme running through a lot of the artworks we are going to see is the use of red and white as a way of highlighting the protagonist to us passers-by. In this instance, our katana-wielding future victim wears red under their armour, and the enemy are nearly monochromatic in colder blacks, greys and blues. This colour coding acts like a sort of video game identifier, whilst also allowing us to understand when Rozalski is trying to tell us something about the scene beyond what is shown. It probably doesn't need stating, but I am a YouTuber and saying the obvious is a big part of what we do. So our samurai friend here looks, well, they look like they're on a fast track to being smeared across the seafront by the world's biggest fly swatter. Let's just say if I were putting a bet on, it would probably be for the samurai to become human mist in the fairly near future. And this is often the case with Rozalski images. They tend to frame the viewer as a small cog in a big machine, a single entity faced with a world of potential danger. And this is an interesting framing, isn't it? It feels like a personification of anxiety, of loneliness in the face of a greater whole. And if I were to apply a bit of an ideology filter, it seems suggestive of the experience of being in a minority of some kind. The protagonist appears to be dressed very differently from the other humans we can see. Their colour scheme and silhouettes show more than a passing resemblance to the big lad there, suggesting that they may be in cahoots against our poor samurai chap. Could this be a little bit of commentary on xenophobia or anti-immigration sentiment, especially given the coastal location? Or is that just me being Britain-brained again, giving our endless discourse on fucking dinghies? Regardless, it is a picture full of narrative, intrigue and bravery in the face of impending doom. It makes you want to know what happens next, which I think is the ultimate goal of the world-building concept artist, and this is something that Rozalski in particular is very good at. But let us move away from the windswept coast of ancient times and take a peek at a very different setting. We move now into the realms of an alternate Earth, a different timeline and a different path taken. The 1920 plus setting is probably Rozalski's most widely known, seeing as its art was used as the basis for popular board game Scythe and strategy video game Iron Harvest. Much like with the ancients, the images in this section tend to use the format of a small protagonist in the foreground and something altogether larger and more ominous in the background, although we do also have another dichotomy to consider now, as Rozalski himself puts it in the opening text of this chapter. In this world, the traditional way of life in harmony with the environment is gradually displaced by technology, powerful machinery and heavy industry. The countryside landscape plays an important role in making the world of 1920 plus feel unique. We see everything mainly from the perspective of the countryside and rural life. People are focused on their own affairs and work, away from the progress and the inevitable change. The technological innovations and the Industrial Revolution arrive here last. They are ordinary people just getting on with their lives whilst huge walking weapons move around them like pieces in a grand chess game, moving as they are to a strategy that they can't understand on the orders of people that don't even know or care that they exist. That is what is known in the trade as a metaphor, folks. A lot of the inspiration for the 1920 plus setting comes from the Polish-Soviet War that was taking place in this period in our timeline, and to be honest, it was not a conflict I knew an awful lot about. Now, as you can imagine, there are a few different takes on this war, and certainly Rozalski's view is that of a Polish patriot. This war and the Battle of Warsaw is considered by many historians to be one of the most important in the history of the world. It altered the course of European history and halted the Red Revolution and the Bolsheviks' march to the west. Now, as someone that constantly oscillates between communist and anarchist depending on what I've been reading most recently, this put my nose a bit out of joint when I first read it. I think there is a compelling argument that the world would be in a better place if we had a little bit more socialism and a bit less capitalism and nationalism. However, I also can't deny that any country has a right to choose its own future, and that being treated as nothing more than a stepping stone to Western Europe by a world power would probably rankle me too. Essentially, both sides in the conflict believed they were reclaiming historic lands, with both making claims on the territory between them. Russia had lost land to the alliance between Germany, Austria and the Ottoman Empire a few years earlier, and Poland was attempting to shore up its borders as a newly independent nation. The fact that Poland was able to fight off the young but substantial Soviet Union was a shock to the world, and plays a big part in Polish culture and self-identity, and it is with this historical context in mind that we should return to the piece. Before the Storm is a dynamic image, full of movement, energy and foreboding, as three huge military walkers stride towards the left of the scene, surrounded by dozens of horseback cavalry that are throwing up billowing trails of dust as they charge towards some unseen threat off of the edge of the picture. In the foreground there stands 5 peasant women that were working in a nearby field, temporarily stopping to take in the surreal nature of such a scene. As Rozalski has stated, I think you can also find a certain kind of longing and nostalgia for the world, for living close to nature, romanticism, wild forests and rural landscapes, all of which were violently taken over by progress, technology and civilization. He also adds a little bit of contextual information for this piece when he says, I think that this situation can be compared to the appearance of the first aircraft in the sky. Most people did not quite understand what it was and how it worked, but they accepted it as part of the reality they lived in. And to hark back quickly to Mark Fisher and the concept of the weird, the sense of wrongness associated with the weird, the conviction that this does not belong, is often a sign that we are in the presence of the new. 1920 plus is a period of rapid change, and the visual dissonance of this is where Rozalski likes to play. Returning to our perspective in the image, we share a view with the local peasantry and as such identify with them. They are dressed mainly in red and white, the colours of the Polish flag, and are an example of innocence in the face of overwhelming violence, as well as the small in the face of the very large. It is worth noting that the Poland-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921 is credited as being the last war to feature cavalry as a major feature, and so Rozalski captures the strange sight of war machines moving side by side with horses, capturing the bizarre sentiment of a war taking place on horseback just a year after a First World War that had the first tanks rumbling around Western Europe. The general mood of the piece is troubling. It feels uncertain, and is certainly not full of the triumph of victory, but rather the unknown of the pre-battle, a scene that feels full of the palpable fear of coming conflict. The dark shadows that follow behind the cavalry and war machines feel malevolent, and the heavy clouds threaten to blot out the sun almost entirely as the oncoming conflict threatens to plunge the whole world into the choking, dusty darkness of an impossibly large-scale war. However, there still remains some sunlight that fights its way through the clouds in fierce columns of white, shining down on the advancing Polish forces and perhaps impressing on us that they go to fight for the hope of a nation, or even a world. Whatever we might think of Rozalski's politics, this is a breathtaking and captivating vision of a dieselpunk setting. This third picture is from the folk stories section and is described as follows by Rozalski on artstation.com. Commemorating the Battle of Grunwald, where the combined forces of Polish and Lithuanian knights crushed the power of the Teutonic Order, it was also the largest battle of the Middle Ages. If you can recognise this knight on the foreground, then you know that the big guy at the back has a serious problem. So this one had me googling again. So hopefully some of this info that follows is correct. Also, apologies for any pronunciations. I first tried to identify the crest on this character's back, and after a bit of googling, I believe it belongs to the Lord High Steward of Kalisz and the House of Zaremba. I then googled who held that position in 1410, and I was told Marcin of Slavska, apologies again for pronunciations, also known as Marcin of Wrocławicza, the standard bearer for the Polish forces in the battle. However, there is no standard in the image, and I can't find much in the way of heroics associated with our Marchin. In fact, the only moment of comment I can find is that he dropped the standard and it had to be rescued by other knights, so it's probably not him, I guess. However, a short Wikipedia entry on him does mention he carried the banner of the territory of Krakow, under which a unit consisting of Poland's elite knights, including such chivalrous celebrities as Zawizar the Black. Now, this was a name that I've seen come up a few times and feels much more likely to be our protagonist, so I clicked the wiki link, and though there isn't much to find there, we do see. During his life, he was regarded as a model of knightly virtues and was renowned for winning multiple tournaments. So I mean, that's main character energy, right? But then, according to more popular and more probable theory, his nickname came from his black hair. The second theory proposes that the nickname came from his custom-made black armour. This guy does sound badass, like a sort of medieval Captain Blackbeard. But our protagonist isn't wearing black armour, and there is no hair on display. Could I have got this wrong? It was about here where I found out that Zawizar the Black was of course not his real name. It was in fact Zawizar Shani, and thankfully there was way more information on this chap. A court chronicler around the time of his death wrote of him. He proved a brave and distinguished knight, renowned for his courage and great deeds in which none could equal him. Above all, he possessed the rare quality of displaying the boldest zeal in battle, but also the most measured prudence in council. For his heroic deeds, he deserves not my weak praise, but also the praise of Homer himself. So, I think we have our hero, who also features in this famous old painting by Jan Matejko. Returning to Rozalski's image, the courage he presents as he faces not only a much larger force but also a physically much larger foe is impressive. A foe that towers over the whole battlefield dressed in the colours of the German Teutonic Knights. Indeed, it calls back to the first image we looked at, Stranger in a Strange Land. A lone warrior stands defiant against not only a more numerous foe, but also against a titanic enemy that is seemingly unassailable. Our protagonist in this instance, rather than being presented in their fabled black armour, is instead dressed in the colours of Poland, as well as wearing its white eagle sigil on their shield, and this choice feels like a metaphor for Rozalski's views on Polish history to some extent. Shani is stripped of his individuality, his black hair and armour, and is instead turned into little more than an avatar for Polish patriotism, a golem made of pure nationalistic pride. And then there is also the size discrepancy. Our protagonist is outnumbered, and facing a literal giant, the odds seem stacked against him, and we marvel at his courage as he stands his ground in the face of impossible odds and probably a red pulpy oblivion. As we have previously discussed, this is a very common Rozalski trope of course, but here, with the historical context we have, it doesn't quite work. Whilst the exact number of people present at the Battle of Grunwald vary a lot in estimation, since there were a lot less number nerds running the stats back then, one thing that is widely understood is that the Polish-Lithuanian forces had more soldiers. They were in fact the more numerous force. We can argue that perhaps the size of the Teutonic giant reflects the historic and cultural significance of their order, acting as a military arm of Christianity. But the numbers facing our protagonist and his isolation feel contrary to my admittedly surface level research. It is one thing to put this piece into the folk stories section, but if you then emblazon national symbols and weigh it down with historical significance, we can no longer treat it as purely fantasy. It becomes something else. It becomes commentary. There's nothing I particularly wanted to say about this one, but look at it! I want to see this movie. Anyway, moving on. Lady in Red depicts a woman dressed in what I would consider to be traditional gypsy clothing in Rozalski's preferred protagonist colours of red and white, flanked by a dark wolf, and beyond them several large werewolves in different dynamic poses, suggesting a scene that's full of movement. Towards the foreground and sharing our viewing angle is a 19th century soldier who appears to be rather alarmed at the whole scene, perhaps understandably, as Rozalski explains on his ArtStation site. A new painting from my 1863 Wolfpack project about the group of extraordinary insurgents fighting against the Russian Empire in the 19th century Poland. Remember, if you see a beautiful woman alone in the dark forest, run. Rozalski tweaks his formula for a number of his Wolfpack images, positioning his protagonists often deeper into the images, and instead putting the impending victim nearer to the foreground. Because most of his images in this section feature the Wolfpack, the werewolves and their human counterparts hunting Russian soldiers, you might expect to see more of the werewolf perspective, with them standing in the foreground. But the key thing to remember here is that Rozalski is not as interested in courage and heroism in this section, but more horror. He wants the werewolves to be scary. He wants them to occupy the role that the giants have in the previous pictures, the impending doom that comes for those with whom we share a perspective. Once again though, this setting hinges on a somewhat romanticised view of history. Talking of the fight against Russia once again, as Polish insurgents rose up in search of Polish independence in what became known as the January Uprising. The whole situation was fraught by a number of internal and external pressures, with Poland wanting more independence, the Russian Empire having been weakened by the Crimean War, and the Gil Gunderson-style leadership of one Alexander Wielopolski, who managed to just make everything worse, as per this from Wikipedia. In an attempt to derail the Polish national movement, he brought forward to January the conscription of young Polish activists into the Imperial Russian Army for 20-year service. That decision is what triggered the January Uprising of 1863, the very outcome that Wielopolski had wanted to avoid. In this alternate timeline, Rozalski imagines a terrifying force of werewolves that are fighting for Polish freedom during this time, and frames them as the thing to be feared. This is pretty much the only time Poland is portrayed as the more powerful force in his images, and there is definitely a bit of power fantasy in there, but there is a lot to enjoy on this dark, frosty landscape full of terror and blood. Now, looking at art and searching Wikipedia has been fun and all, but it does seem to be missing something. Ah yes, of course, it needs some internet drama. Whilst doing some research for this video, I came across quite the controversy about some of Rozalski's work, with him being publicly accused of tracing over photographs and other artists' images in order to create his artworks. Reddit and boardgamegeek.com have multiple threads going over supposed examples of this practice, with heated debates over what is considered okay and what is clearly plagiarism. Jamie Stegmaier, the designer of popular board game Scythe, the game that heavily utilised Rozalski's images, came out with a statement that conceded that there may be some truth to the accusations, but that it's not as controversial as it may initially seem. This is pretty transparent. There doesn't appear to be any big cover-up or conspiracy. Part of the assertion seems to be that Jakub is a hack because he traced some animals and people. Traced is a bit of a misnomer. If you asked me to trace a photo of a tiger, it wouldn't look anything close to Jakub's illustration. I believe Jakub when he says he painted these animals and people while referencing the photographs, not by digitally painting over them. I would point to Jakub's canvas paintings as evidence that his talents do not require photo bashing. To completely discredit his illustrations, each of which is a complex amalgamation of different elements in the foreground, midground and background, just because he used some reference photos from animals and people, doesn't seem fair. It ultimately seems to come down to what is considered fair play and what is considered piggybacking on the work of others. It's an argument that has even more spice now that we're living with AI generated art being defended by lazy hacks and tech bros as being basically the same as when human artists inspire or copy each other. No matter the obvious flaws and contradictions of such a weak and disingenuous argument, this won't be the last time we hear it, I am sure. There is little doubt that Jakub Rozalski possesses a prodigious talent for creating intriguing images that capture a moment. The final breath before the charge, the flash before the thunder, the heartbeat as you go over the edge. His artworks feel like trailers for some forthcoming action movie, full of heroes, robots, mechs, samurai, Vikings, giants, golems, and mythical monsters. There is a richness and a dynamism to his pictures that make you feel like you are viewing a different world altogether, and it is no surprise that he has been involved with a bunch of different board and video game projects that have utilised the alternate realities that Rozalski has created. However, I stumbled into a fairly significant issue early on in the writing of this video, after I was finally able to source a copy of Howling at the Moon at a non-ridiculous price. My original plan was to look at 2 or 3 images from each of the book's sections, and to put out a much longer video that would really dig into the themes and ideologies present in each setting, and what it could tell us about the worlds Rozalski had created, and indeed Rozalski himself. It became apparent that if you group a bunch of Rozalski's works together, the general compositions, colour schemes and themes quickly started to blur together. The small and vulnerable protagonist in the foreground, the huge or threatening antagonist in the background, the use of red and white to denote our heroes or innocence. It all became a little bit samey. These are amazing pieces of art, but perhaps Rozalski's art is best consumed in short bursts. Certainly, Wolfpack 1863 and Folk Stories are a little better in terms of the variability of the composition and vibe, and were just a generally much more enjoyable part for me. And I mean, that gnome movie needs to get made. Overall, I am happy that I finally got hold of this book. It has some genuinely brilliant pieces in it, and for those that are fans of fantastical art, this has an awful lot to like. Well, look at that. The first rays of the sun emerge, and we live to face another day. Perhaps one day soon we shall meet again. Farewell and Godspeed. Thanks to all those that have watched this far. Please rest assured I see you in my YouTube studio stats, you happy little 100%ers. If you have enjoyed the video, please do give it a like, and please consider leaving a little comment as well, as both these things help YouTube to see it as worth sharing further. Thanks to Mrs. Inside Left for all their support and help with the script, to Robert Gordon and Advent Song for the use of their music, and to the We Create Together group for their support and suggestions. Take care all, be brave, be kind, and be safe. Goodbye for now.